Due to the success of the first Final Fantasy, Square commissioned not one, but 2 sequels to this game. These 2 sequels were developed simultaneously and by the same team, only for one game to be released about a year after the other. Like Final Fantasy II, this game would also push the Famicom to its limits to make the biggest game they possibly could. Unfortunately, due to the aforementioned problems with bringing Final Fantasy II to North America that I mentioned in the last video, the English localization for this game was skipped over in its entirety. However, 17 years later, Square would eventually release this game for the newly released Nintendo DS handheld console. Video game pundits would hype up this release by saying things like, "The only Final Fantasy to never come out in America comes out in America." Today, I will be taking an in-depth look at the DS version of this game. I will not have a dedicated section of this video to discussing the game's development cycle. Since the game was developed alongside Final Fantasy II, there isn't really anything I can say about this game that I haven't already said in the last video. So I won't comment on the game's development beyond this one paragraph. So with that out of the way, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Final Fantasy III Retrospective. You may recall in my last retrospective video that one of the things I complained about with the PS1 remake was the fact that it failed to take full advantage of the PS1's graphical capabilities, which would have been disappointing in its own right, but made even more so by the fact that the game opened with a 3D cutscene that implied that the game was going to be 3D, only for the game to revert to 16-bit graphics for the remainder of its duration. Well, I can happily say that this is not the case with Final Fantasy III. This game takes full advantage of the Nintendo DS's 3D graphics engine and stays 3D from beginning to end. There's no voice acting in this game, but that's okay. I much prefer the pantomime that is used to convey emotion anyway, although I realize that's subjective. This has always been a hallmark of games on Nintendo consoles versus games on PlayStation or Xbox consoles. Since Nintendo's consoles tend to prefer seamless loading times and quickly rendering assets over sheer scope and size, their consoles have traditionally sacrificed disk storage space, effectively meaning that games on Nintendo consoles move at a much faster pace, but at the cost of things like voice acting. To compensate for this, characters need to have heavily exaggerated body movements in order to convey emotions, and for me personally, I actually prefer it that way. However, one thing I have to criticize about this game's graphics is that, while it takes full advantage of the DS's 3D graphics engine, it doesn't take full advantage of the DS's namesake gimmick, the dual screens. The lion's share of gameplay is conveyed in the bottom screen, which is why I have made that screen so much bigger than the top screen for the purposes of this video. However, for the most part, the top screen is pretty incidental. When you're in the overworld, the top screen gets the most use because you can see the overworld map. This negates the need for a potentially convoluted button combination in order to bring up the world map, and it makes it a lot easier to navigate the vast oceans, since you can simply defer to the map to see where you're going rather than having to rely on landmarks. However, that's really the only time the top screen is put to any good use. When you're in a town or dungeon, or if you're in combat, the top screen is not used at all. Well, occasionally it is used. Whenever you pause the game and bring up the status menu, the bottom screen scrolls up to the top so you can still see what's happening in the game world. However, this is a completely unnecessary addition, since the NPCs never move, and you won't get any random encounters in the dungeons if you're standing still. You have to move to be attacked by an enemy, so it won't happen when you have the menu pulled up. Obviously, this is because this is only a 3D remake of a game that was originally made for the Famicom, so I'll cut it some slack there, but I'm not going to ignore the issue completely. The only time the top screen is put to any creative use is during cutscenes. For example, after defeating the land turtle, the first boss of the game, there's some text appearing on the top screen, with Luneth looking up, indicating that the voice was coming from above. That's a method of choreography that could only work if the game A had 2 screens and B didn't have voice acting, so kudos there. However, in 99% of cases in this game, the top screen is ultimately superfluous. Fortunately, I can definitively say that the soundtrack is put to good use. Tsuyoshi Sakita, who scored the PS1 remake of Final Fantasy II, returns to bring his A-game to Final Fantasy III. The overworld theme provides an exciting sense of adventure and exploration. While the town themes are nice and peaceful. Meanwhile, the dungeon themes are creepy and invoke a sense of foreboding. However, there is one part of the game's music that especially stands out. My jaw hit the floor when I first heard the music for regular battles in this game. Hey, those of you who grew up playing Super Mario RPG on the Super NES, raise your hand if this music rings any nostalgic bells. Sound familiar? Here, maybe this'll jog your memory. Yup. While this is not a perfect match, the opening notes for the game's battle music are clearly inspired by the beginning of the Kulex theme song from Super Mario RPG. Now, if I'm being fair, I have to concede that it was in fact the other way around. This game may have been ported to the Nintendo DS in 2006, but it was originally released for the Famicom in 1990, years before Super Mario RPG came out. However, the soundtrack for the Famicom version of this game was composed by Nobuyo Uematsu, which means it sounded like crap. So I'm still going to give this version credit for actually having a soundtrack that isn't nails on a chalkboard. To add a cherry on top of the soundtrack sundae, I can definitively say that this game's boss music likewise actually conveys a sense of tension and urgency, making the boss fights feel like a battle to the death. Unlike the previous game's boss fight music, which gave off more of a 1001 Arabian Nights vibe. And last but not least, the music for the final dungeon of the game is absolutely downright epic. So overall, the game's aesthetic presentation is a huge step up from the previous game, with the exception of its failure to take full advantage of the dual screens, which is understandable since the game was only designed for one screen anyway. Nearly everything is an improvement over the last game. While I have criticized this game for failing to take full advantage of the dual screen feature of the hardware it was released on, I do not honestly have any problems with the game's failure to take full advantage of the touchscreen. The game does indeed utilize the touchscreen for movement. Tap where you want to move and the player character will move there. Meanwhile, the corners of the screen have icons that can be used to center the camera, bring up the status menu, and speak with your guest character. It's ultimately nothing truly creative or unique, but that's certainly better than the developers trying to push the envelope with innovative touchscreen controls for its own sake, only to pratfall and have the ambitious control scheme executed like shit. Furthermore, the touchscreen controls are entirely optional. It is entirely possible to play the whole game from start to finish just by using the D-pad and buttons, since that's the way the game was originally meant to be played in the first place. Since the map takes up the top screen in the overworld, that saves us the rather convoluted control scheme from Final Fantasy II, where the 2 buttons at a time were used to bring up the world map for no reason. Instead, every function in the game is mapped to only a single button, which is nice. However, one thing that really baffles me is that the start button isn't used to bring up the status menu for this game. Instead, the X button is used to do that. I must assume that the start button was used to bring up the menu on the original Famicom version, since that console didn't even have an X button at all. But on the DS, the fact that the start button isn't used to pause the game took some getting used to. In the early hours of playing this game, I kept pressing the start button on instinct, only for nothing to happen. That being said, the controls definitely feature a quality of life improvement in that you can set the run speed as the character's default movement speed. Instead of holding down the B button constantly to move at a decent speed, you can instead move at that speed constantly and only hold down the B button if you want to move slowly rather than quickly. Seeing as the DS remake of this game was made long after analog stick movement became the industry standard, it was probably seen as inconvenient to simply have a run button that has to be held down constantly. So instead, you have the option of changing the settings so that the B button only has to be used once in a while, which is nice. To my utter delight, the multi-tiered magic pool system from the first game returns for this game, with an added quality of life improvement that you can now unequip spells, although that may not be a standalone quality of life improvement in its own right, but just be a natural extension of the new job system. More on that in a minute. This would certainly have been a much appreciated feature in the first game. In that game, there were 4 spells for each magic tier, but you only had enough slots for 3 spells per tier. This means that my white and black mages had to buy only 3 spells per tier and leave the 4th one behind. This might not have been a big deal except for the fact that you couldn't unequip spells. Once you bought a spell, you had to assign it to a character at that point of sale, and once the character had that spell assigned to him, that's it. It's etched in stone and can't be reversed. This was irksome for a first-time player like myself who didn't know how useful any given spell was going to be. Meanwhile, most of the items from Final Fantasy II return in this game, such as the eye drops, gold needles, etc., with one notable exception: the Ether. In Final Fantasy II, Ether was the standard item used to restore a character's magic. In this game, there aren't any items that restore magic, except the elixir, which restores health and magic in equal measure. I assume that the returning multi-tiered magic pool system is the reason Ether isn't present in this game. After all, with each character having 8 levels of spells that each keep track of their spell points independently of each other, that means that the game would need 8 different items for replenishing the character's spell points for each level, and that would most likely just be confusing to the players and just bog the game down with excessive inventory. This is probably one of the biggest reasons why the multi-tiered magic pool system never quite caught on, which is understandable but a real bummer. I really wish Sakaguchi could have found a way to make it work, just so the RPG genre could have evolved with the multi-tier magic pool system as an equally valid alternative game mechanic. In addition to that, item sorting is now heavily streamlined due to the fact that identical items stack with each other. You can now carry up to 99 of each unique item, and that stack of items will only take up 1 slot in your inventory. This means that your ability to carry 99 high potions does not adversely affect your ability to likewise carry 99 antidotes or 99 gold needles. If you're raking in the dough, you can stock up on a buttload of supplies before heading out into a dungeon, especially health restorative items, and be extremely generous with giving those potions to your characters after every battle to keep them in top shape. In fact, the fact that identical items now stack with each other in your inventory honestly seems to defeat the aforementioned excuse for not having ether. Sure, you may have needed 8 different items to restore your magic meter, but if they stack, that's only 8 different inventory slots rather than having to sift through scores and scores of various levels of ether. Most of us can probably sort through 8 items rather than 1. That's just a minor inconvenience in exchange for having an interesting magic system. Of course, the ability to carry 99 of each item without it taking up space in your inventory means that you can no longer buy Phoenix Downs or elixirs. These items are still in the game, but they only appear in treasure chests, and there's a finite, non-respawning number of them in the game. Now, to an extent, I can understand why they don't give us the ability to simply stock up on a buttload of these things. Considering that the Phoenix Down revives a character from the dead, and the elixir gives them a full heal, having too many of these at one time would effectively make combat trivial. Just keep spamming the elixirs to keep your characters at max health, and the enemies no longer pose a threat. Even if the enemies manage to kill a player character, the Phoenix Downs would effectively render death as just a mid-tier status ailment on par with petrification. That being said, while I understand the game's desire to not have Phoenix Downs or elixirs be purchasable in shops, I feel Sakaguchi could have afforded to be a little less stingy with the drops in the overworld. As it stands, Phoenix Downs are extremely rare. Even if you go through the game picking up every Phoenix Down in the game and never using a single one of them, it's highly unlikely you'll actually get a full stack of 99 of them. When a character dies, I usually find myself reloading a save state rather than wasting one of my precious Phoenix Downs. Of course, the scarcity of Phoenix Downs and elixirs would hardly be a problem if the combat in this game was fair and balanced. Unfortunately, it isn't. Many battles, especially in the middle and late game, seem heavily balanced on the assumption that the protagonists are at a much higher level than is organic for the player to have reached by that point in the game. Take, for example, this boss fight against the Kraken. You can clearly see that I have Arifia at full health. However, on literally the first turn, the Kraken does a regular attack. Not even a spell, just a regular attack, and doesn't even get a critical hit. And she goes down in one hit. Due to the aforementioned scarcity of Phoenix Downs, the Kraken's ability to one-hit kill my characters makes this boss effectively impossible to defeat at my current level. Now, with the final boss, it makes sense. The final boss is supposed to be invincible until you unleash the Warriors of the Dark. Oh, trust me, I'm gonna rip that subplot a new one later in this video, to get rid of her invincibility. However, aside from that, the enemies in this game have no business being so unbalanced. As it stands, the only way it seems I can possibly measure up against the mid and late game bosses in normal gameplay is by spending hours and hours grinding to hell and back. Just running around in circles in the exact same location, killing the same enemies over and over again. That is not fun, that is just tedious. There's a reason why grinding is often used in modern games to increase the appeal of microtransactions, because nobody wants to fucking do it. Well, you know what? I say fuck grinding, action replay codes to the rescue. Fortunately, according to the things I have read while doing research for this retrospective series, I have heard that the next game in the series, Final Fantasy IV, is the first game in the series to severely cut down on the need for grinding. I haven't played 4 yet, but only time will tell if I feel the game delivers on its promise of not being as grindy or unbalanced as the original trilogy. The dungeons themselves still, for the most part, act as bland, featureless mazes with random enemy encounters. However, there is at least one single solitary improvement to the dungeon layout in this game: hidden passageways. You will often come across dead ends and have to find some way to progress that isn't immediately obvious. Most of the time, this just involves you flipping a switch to open a hidden passageway. I personally find this mechanic to be both a failure and a success. At the beginning, the game tries to give a tutorial on how this mechanic works by telling the player to look for sparkles as an indication that there's a hidden passageway you can unlock. However, aside from this one close-up shot, I could never for the life of me notice the sparkles in any of the dungeons. However, despite the dead giveaway never being apparent, I nevertheless never seemed to have any difficulty telling where the hidden passageways were. Maybe it's due to the improved graphics from being ported onto the Nintendo DS, but I could typically just tell based on instinct where the switches were located with only a minor amount of trial and error. Perhaps if I were playing this on the Famicom, the graphics would be so primitive that I really would need to look out for sparkles to find the switches. So the mechanic is both a success and a failure at the same time. But sometimes you literally just go out of bounds to reach another area, and this mechanic really is a pain in the ass. Because going out of bounds like that often means you are forced to navigate through a series of invisible walls with no visual landmarks to guide you. You're basically running around with a bucket on your head. This entire mechanic is a pain in the ass, but the Cave of Shadows dungeon is the most pain in the ass example of this pain in the ass mechanic. The entire dungeon is based around this gimmick, and it becomes confusing as all hell to navigate because of this. Considering that the player character continues the running animation even when he's running up against walls, this effectively means I have no way of knowing when I'm making progress towards my destination or when I'm just running up against a wall. Even with the improved visuals of the Nintendo DS, this mechanic is still just tedious and frustrating. The job system is also a failure for me. It basically replaces the class system from the first game. The 6 classes from the first game are recycled into jobs for this one, along with a few new ones. I honestly find the job system rather underwhelming. How skilled you are in combat depends on a combination of your character's level and your job level, and you grind up the job level by engaging in battles. This basically means that the job level is entirely redundant of your character level, since both are increased by fighting enemies and both contribute to your character's combat prowess. For those of you who have been with this channel for a long time, you may recall from my Skyrim retrospective video that I defended Bethesda's decision to axe the attribute system in Skyrim. I also defended their decision to axe the skills system in my Fallout 4 retrospective. My reasons for defending those controversial choices in those two games is the reason I feel the job system in this game doesn't work. if there are two stats that are identical in nearly every way and govern the same thing in the game, in this case combat, it makes sense to only have one. Having two entirely redundant stats in the game just causes confusion among the players. I appreciate a game with depth to it, but there's a difference between a game having depth and a game that has a completely unnecessary extra step to a mechanic that exists just to have complexity for its own sake in an attempt to add depth where there is none. The jobs themselves don't really make up for the added unnecessary complexity either. As I mentioned earlier, the 6 classes from Final Fantasy I return here as jobs, so for my playthrough I went with a white mage, a black mage, and 2 warriors. The warriors got upgraded to knights halfway through. I went with 2 warriors because, as I mentioned in my Final Fantasy I retrospective, the thief was just a shittier version of the warrior. However, Final Fantasy III adds a few extra jobs, such as Bard, Geomancer, and Evoker. However, aside from aesthetics, there's really not that much difference between them. The only difference is what kind of weapons and armor they can equip. But aside from the spells, these weapons and armor are all completely interchangeable and have no unique effect on gameplay. Sure, it's cute to have a bard in the group and see an enemy essentially be melodied to death, but once the novelty of seeing that attack animation wears off, the attack itself is functionally no different than simply hitting the enemy with a sword. So, ultimately, the game throws all this variety at you with its job system, but half of the options you get are just watered-down versions of other jobs with much more straightforward pros and cons. The phrase, "wide as an ocean, deep as a puddle," rings ever true with this game's job system. However, one mechanic that I absolutely like about this game is the way it adds a sense of progression to your ship. In the previous 2 games, you progressed in your transportation simply by getting new things, not by upgrading your existing things. You got a boat, then you got a canoe, then you got an airship. Once you got the airship, the boat was never needed again. But with Final Fantasy III, you actually get an airship pretty early on. Instead of getting new stuff, you actually add upgrades to your existing transportation vessels to make them able to traverse different terrain and cover new ground. You start by adding a cannon to your first airship, so you can blow up a boulder that's blocking your progression to the rest of the game map. This, however, has the effect of destroying your airship, so you're once again reduced to hoofing it for a little while. You come across some Vikings who offer to give you one of their ships if you can either kill or tame a sea dragon that's been killing them. I actually like this turn of events. For once, you aren't getting a boat because pirates picked a fight with you, and you kicked their asses before taking their boat as a form of punitive damages. Instead, you get it from Vikings, not pirates, and more importantly, they hand the ship over willingly. As I mentioned in the Final Fantasy II retrospective, that was just repetitive to do it like that for 2 games in a row, so I definitely approve of this game shaking up the formula. So we sail around for a little bit before eventually getting an upgrade to the boat that allows it to fly. With the power of flight, we can now leave the floating continent, and then the game really opens up. However, the airship can only land on water for the time being, since it used to be a ship before it was an airship. I actually like this mechanic. It makes the airship feel different than from the first game, plus it also drives home the idea that this isn't an entirely new vessel, just an upgrade to your existing vessel. Eventually, that ship gets heavily damaged by a royal army of a kingdom we were flying over. Once the king gets freed from his mind control spell that's forcing him to be a dick to people, his team of mages repair our ship and even enable it to move at much faster speeds. This is definitively the best way to get around the game map. Pshew, pshew, this thing just moves like the Flash! Eventually, we get the ability to dive underwater, turning this baby into a combination airship and submarine. We then get an even bigger airship that has the ability to hop over small mountains and also dual serves as a base of operations for the player characters. This system of progression for our transportation vessels is both a refreshing change of pace for the Final Fantasy formula, as well as a rewarding system in its own right. My only real gripe with this system is that the Chocobo gets completely lost in the shuffle as a result of it. You may recall from my last video that the Chocobo from that game felt pretty incidental, as there was only one point in the entire game where it was actually useful. Well, this game somehow made the Chocobo both more readily available and even more useless at the same time. There's now a spell that you can cast that can immediately summon a Chocobo to your location, allowing you to use it as a mount whenever and wherever you so choose. However, you never really need to use the bird at any point in the game. Because you almost always have a valid airship available, that method of transportation will always be preferable to using the Chocobo. They really should have had a few segments where your airship was either damaged or kept under lock and key, and where you had to traverse long distances on foot before you had the ship again. Then it would have been useful to use the Chocobo for such a purpose. As it stands, the Chocobo is completely lost in the shuffle. Sakaguchi removed the barriers to accessibility for the Chocobo, but also completely removed any incentive to actually use it. So overall, the gameplay for this game is hit or miss. It attempts to bring the best of both worlds from the first two games into one combination. Sometimes this attempt to combine the mechanics across two games works out pretty well, but other times it just complicates things for no reason. The main characters in this game are especially infuriating, not because they are unlikable assholes, but because they actually start off interesting, only to relegate to being blank slates. Each character has a clear personality trait at the beginning that, if Sakaguchi were interested in telling a story like he claims to be, lend themselves perfectly to natural character arcs. But instead, these character traits are summarily dropped early on and never paid off. Luneth is the first character you play as, and he is introduced falling into a cave because he wasn't watching where he was going. He's clearly adventurous and headstrong, and therefore is a natural-born leader for the Warriors of the Light. However, he's perhaps a little too adventurous for his own good, as his first outing shows. This naturally lends itself to a character arc about learning to rein his adventurousness in. He should learn that his thirst for adventure borders on a reckless disregard for his own life. There should be at least a few moments throughout the game where he charges in gung-ho into a situation without thinking about the consequences of his actions, thereby forcing the rest of the Warriors of the Light to have to run in and clean up his messes. His character arc should revolve around learning to have a little restraint and just a bare minimum amount of forethought before he charges in. Ark is Luneth's childhood best friend, but he's the opposite of Luneth in every way. Whereas Luneth is headstrong and adventurous, Ark is shy and a bookworm. Because of this, he is often made fun of by the other kids in his and Luneth's village of He joins Luneth on his adventure not because he has a sense of duty to be a warrior of the light, he doesn't even know he's one of those guys yet, but rather just to try and prove to the other kids that he's not a weakling or a coward. This would naturally lend itself to a character arc about learning to ignore his naysayers, to not give a damn what they think of him. It's clear that these fuckwads are going to continue to bully him no matter how much he proves himself, so there's no point in trying to appease assholes who treat you like shit. Furthermore, whereas Luneth might be a natural-born leader, Ark's existing character trait naturally lends itself to him being the smart guy of the group. He should have been the one to provide a good chunk of exposition because he read about it in so many books. Rifia is the only woman of the group. She's studying under her father to be a blacksmith, but she hates the work. She finds it dull and boring, and she wants something greater out of life. Because of this, she actually runs away from home immediately before the events of the series, causing her dad to worry sick. This should naturally lend itself to a character arc about accepting one's responsibilities and not shirking them. Last but not least, Ingus is a royal bodyguard in the nearby kingdom of Sassoon. Whereas Ark is the antithesis to Luneth, Ingus is the antithesis to Rifia. Ingus is passionately and single-mindedly devoted to his duties of protecting Princess Sarah at all cost. A natural and organic character arc for Ingus would be for him to simply accept that it's okay to take breaks every once in a while. It's okay to smell the roses and not be obsessed around the clock with his work, to find a balance between business and pleasure. The problem with all four of these character arcs is that the game seems wholly uninterested in exploring them. After the characters' introductions, their traits are never brought up again, either in gameplay or in story. The only warrior whose original character trait is ever even mentioned again is Rifia, who, after the final boss is destroyed, spontaneously and arbitrarily decides to buckle down and become a blacksmith. This is not a character arc. This is just paying lip service to the character trait that she had at the beginning of the game. We never see Rifia come to the conclusion that she was wrong to run away from home. We never see her ever become homesick. We never see her come to the realization that blacksmiths can do a lot of good for people and that there's plenty of excitement to be had in welding metal. Nope, she just spontaneously decides to be a blacksmith after previously not wanting to be one. I said it before in my Final Fantasy II retrospective, and it bears repeating here. Giving a single throwaway line and having a character undergo a sudden about-face is not character development. Character development is supposed to happen over the course of the story, and more importantly, the audience needs to actually see that character development happen step by step. Think about it this way. Remember Dragon Ball Z? Oh yeah, everyone remembers that show. Now remember Dragon Ball Z Kai? Remember how the latter was supposed to remove 99% of filler, and that commitment to removing filler meant that Gohan's wilderness survival training, as well as Goku's adventures on Snake Way, were cut out almost completely, so that literally just one episode after these subplots got underway, we can see that the subplots have completely resolved themselves. One episode later, and Gohan is kicking berries down from trees, and Goku has made it to the end of Snake Way, despite the fact that both were supposed to be long and perilous journeys. Remember how short-changed we all felt when those subplots were completely removed from the show? How it seemed to completely trivialize the trials and perils that these two characters supposedly underwent? Compared to the original anime, with all its filler intact, it seemed that the Gohan and Goku of DBZ Kai were just making mountains out of molehills. Gohan was afraid that he wouldn't be able to survive out in the wild, not because that's actually an arduous and dangerous task, but simply because he was scared to do so. But then it turns out that surviving in the wilderness isn't nearly as hard as it sounds, so Gohan just came off like a whiny bitch. That's the feeling I get from Rifia and her sudden decision to buckle down and become a blacksmith. There was no character arc, she just had her original character completely retconned. Throughout the game, all four Warriors of the Light become completely interchangeable blank slates. They have no character development or personalities to speak of. Even the character traits that were present in the first hours of the game are entirely missing for the rest of the game. I mean, if you're not going to develop the characters, why did you go through all the trouble of setting up these character traits? Why not just have the characters be blank slates from the beginning to end? It would still be bland and uninteresting, but at least you wouldn't be teasing me with the promise of character development when you had no intention of delivering the goods. With the exception of one group, the side characters don't fare much better in this respect either. Most of the NPCs in this game are complete blank slates. I can accept that from most of the NPCs in the game that I only ever interact with once each, but there are several guest characters who follow us around at various points in the game, and these characters are just as much blank slates as everyone else in the game. Priestess Arya is a blank slate. Princess Sarah is a blank slate. Sid is a walking exposition box rather than a character. Desh's entire personality boils down to he has amnesia. That's it. That's his entire character. He just has amnesia. Meanwhile, Prince Alice has daddy issues. His entire character's shtick is that his father abandoned him and exiled him from the castle. But as far as Alice's actual character and personality is concerned, he has none. He is just a white meat babyface good guy. There's almost no real depth to him. Speaking of Prince Alice, he has probably the most complex subplot in this entire game, although that's not exactly a high bar to clear. His shtick is that the king has become a dickhead practically overnight and has become a tyrannical asshole, shutting down every shop in the kingdom in an attempt to tank his own economy, and even banishing his own son from the castle after the son dared to speak out against him. To solve this, he asks for our assistance and protection when he goes to confront the king and once again try and persuade him to stop all this nonsense. When the king actually confronts us, we find out that he was actually under an evil spell this whole time, and that his tyrannical decrees were not even his own. Yes! This is what needed to happen with Leon in Final Fantasy II. It would have caused all his previous crimes to be forgiven, instead of him just spontaneously deciding to become a good guy for no reason. Unfortunately, Prince Alice's subplot only reveals another problem with this game. Nearly all subplots are brought up and resolved in an extremely episodic manner. That alone isn't a problem. There are plenty of episodic TV shows with self-contained plots. The problem here is that most of these subplots have beginnings and endings, but no middles. They just feel rushed, so there's no real opportunity to develop the stories. They feel like Cliff Notes versions of what was actually intended. What's really irksome about this structure is that Sakaguchi had a perfect structure for this kind of episodic storytelling practically gift-wrapped for him. The overarching story is that the Warriors of the Light need to go around restoring light to the various crystals. There are 4 light crystals, each representing one of the 4 Greek elements of earth, fire, wind, and water. These entire subplots could very easily have been intertwined with the warrior's quest to restore each crystal, much like how, in Super Mario RPG, the subplot of rescuing Dyna and Might from being trapped in the coal mines is intertwined with the hero's quest to collect the 3rd star piece. Instead, the vast majority of these subplots seem entirely disconnected from the main plot. For example, the only reason the Warriors of the Light need to take time out of their quest to focus on Prince Alice's subplot is because the king shot their airship out of the sky, so they have no means of transport until that thing gets repaired. The evil wizard Gigameth could very easily have been holed up inside a nearby dungeon guarding one of the crystals. By defeating Gigameth, we not only managed to restore one of the crystals to its former glory, but also broke the spell he had cast on so many high-ranking royal officers, thereby restoring peace to the kingdom of Saronia. Instead, Gigameth is right there in the castle as soon as it's revealed that the king was under an evil spell. Gigameth shows his true colors, we kick his ass in a boss fight, and poof, that's the end of the subplot. No crystals were obtained, no progress towards our main quest was made. It was all just one great big waste of time. As I said earlier, most of these subplots have a beginning and an end, but no middle, causing them to be resolved way too quickly. But sometimes the subplots don't even have an ending. They literally just get brought up once only to never be brought up or resolved in any way, shape, or form ever again. One of the most egregious examples of this is the Gold Mansion subplot. Some billionaire tycoon has our ship under lock and key, so we go there to try and get the key from him to get our ship back. When we meet him, it turns out that he's also guarding one of the light crystals we need for our main quest. However, after we defeat him in combat, he just destroys the crystal so we can't restore light to it. Now, you may recall from my Final Fantasy I retrospective that I pondered what would happen if one of the 4 orbs ever got destroyed, and what that would mean for the world they were trying to protect. Well, this game actually brings up that idea. Once this tycoon guy destroyed the orange crystal, the Warriors of the Light wondered amongst themselves what would happen to the world now that one of the light crystals was destroyed. I was excited at first that this game was going to explore one of the biggest questions I had about the first game's mythos. However, once that little conversation was over, this entire subplot is never brought up again. We find the crystal again inside the ancient maze, and we restore the light to that crystal then. So does that mean that this tycoon didn't have the real crystal but only just had a copy? Or did the crystal repair itself and then move itself away from the tycoon so that he couldn't destroy it a second time? The implications of the destroyed crystal are never explored. The subplot literally just has a beginning. It has neither a middle or even an ending. Hey Sakaguchi, have you ever heard of Chekhov's gun? It's one of the rules of writing, and it says, if you say in the first chapter that there is a rifle hanging on the wall, in the second or third chapter it absolutely must go off. If it's not going to be fired, it shouldn't be hanging there. That is basically what you did with the Broken Crystal subplot. You set up a potentially interesting subplot only to never give it any kind of payoff. And that's just lazy. So, there are subplots aplenty, but very few of them have clear beginnings, middles, and ends. Meanwhile, there are plenty of NPCs, but very few of them have any real character to speak of. In fact, it becomes pretty clear early on that this entire world exists for no other reason than for the player to quest around in it. So there is almost no civilization, culture, architecture, art, or people. The few buildings in the game all look exactly the same, and the few people in the game literally exist for no other reason than to spout exposition at the player. Unai was the character that made me realize this about the NPCs because she is the most direct and upfront with her exposition. She's extremely short and to the point when it comes to delivering exposition. You wake her up from her eternal slumber and she gets right to work, just dumping all the info she's supposed to give you. She briefs you on how the ship works, and then she just abruptly vanishes into thin air, because once her exposition is complete, there's no need for her to stick around. Now, to an extent, I suppose this might have been intentional. The fact that Uni is the only character who is so blunt suggests that the bluntness of her exposition delivery was supposed to make her a unique character. Perhaps it was supposed to even be endearing that she is so straightforward with you. However, all it really does is highlight just how nearly every other NPC in the game exists for the sole purpose of vomiting exposition. At least most of the other NPCs make some attempt to contextualize their exposition. For example, this person who tells me about the lemongrass shoes is clearly just dumping exposition. However, that at least is contextualized as barroom gossip. Uni is practically breaking the fourth wall and acknowledging that she literally has no purpose for existing other than to be a pair of lips that exposition gets spewed out of. However, there is one group of NPCs in this game who actually have a sliver of characterization and personality to them, and that's the Peanut Gallery. They're a collection of old farts who have deluded themselves into thinking that they are the Warriors of the Light. They obviously believe their own hype, because they willingly tread into the sewers in an attempt to save the day themselves. If they were just full of hot air and knew themselves that they were just full of hot air, what would they have to gain by going into the sewers? They only stand to forfeit their lives by engaging the monsters in those sewers. However, after you save their asses, they come to terms with the fact that you must be the Warriors of the Light after all. Yes, some actual character development up in this shit. Oh, and they're literally just called the Peanut Gallery. I want to know how they got that name, because that name is so stupid, but it's endearing primarily because of how dumb it is. All in all, the Peanut Gallery are just goofy enough and just memorable enough to stand out from the rest of the NPCs in the game. And I couldn't help but smile at the end when Goga recruited one of them to help save the day during the game's climax. The Peanut Gallery may not be the Warriors of the Light, but at least one of them gets to be a hero in the end, which I definitely feel they deserved. So, main characters, side characters, and subplots are all abject failures across the board. That just leaves the main plot as the last bastion of hope for this game's story to be any good. Unfortunately, even that falls flat. The fact that it's the main plot rather than a subplot means that it gets the most screen time and thus the most opportunity to develop. However, because it is the main plot and not just a subplot, that means it has a much higher bar to meet in order to be considered good. At the beginning, the Wind Crystal, by the way, I'm assuming that the crystals are the gods in this polytheistic religion, since at one point, a priestess literally prays to the water crystal directly rather than to any god, so apparently the crystals are the gods, recruits the 4 main characters to become the Warriors of the Light, claiming that they were all chosen at birth to be the Warriors. Right off the bat, a golden storytelling opportunity is completely squandered. This seems like a golden opportunity to explore the main theme of destiny versus free will. Imagine if one or more of the main characters might actually resent being chosen by the Wind Crystal. Revia makes the least sense for this potential story arc. She resents taking up her father's role of being a blacksmith, so it makes sense that she would leap at the call to adventure more than any of the others. However, Ingus is a perfect fit for this story arc. He has a sworn duty to protect Princess Sarah, and yet he just abandons his post by her side so he can go off and be a Warrior of the Light. Oh sure, he promises to return just as soon as he's finished saving the world, but for someone who is as single-mindedly devoted to his duties as Ingus is, he should have at least some internal struggle conflicting with these 2 duties. Hell, you would think at least a few eyebrows would be raised at the halfway point when Sid explains that their parents were actually killed in a storm as they were migrating to the floating continent. Bear in mind that as they met each other, they all confided in each other that they were all orphans. They took this as proof that the Wind Crystal did indeed know from birth that they were going to be the Warriors of the Light. At first, I wondered if this meant that the Warriors were all born from Immaculate Conception. But nope, Sid eventually explains that their parents were all migrating to the floating continent on Sid's airship when a storm started brewing. Sid and the 4 future Warriors of the Light were the only survivors. Now, combine that with the fact that their orphanage was used to prove their destinies as being the chosen Warriors of the Light. That basically means that the Wind Crystal literally fucking killed their parents, so they would have no connections and therefore no reason not to drop their existing lives so they can go off and be the Warriors of the Light. And the Light Crystal is still considered the good guy. You would think that at least a few of the Warriors would be acting like Nicolas Cage from Ghost Rider, resenting Satan for killing his father just to prevent him from having any ties or distractions. But nope, even when confronted with this horrifying, traumatizing news, the Warriors of the Light never consider even the possibility that their destinies might be interfering with their happiness. While we're on the topic, I'd like to know just how old the Warriors of the Light all are. Because if they're any younger than 16, then I have some serious moral qualms about them all running off into unspeakable danger to save the world. Hell, even 16 years old is the absolute bare minimum. Realistically, I'd prefer them to all be at least 18 years old, but any younger than 16 is absolutely out of the question. However, when Sid gives the exposition about how their parents died, he says that this happened 10 years before the events of the game. If they were all 16 years at the events of the game, they would have been 6 years old when the migration happened. However, if they were that old, they would still have at least some memories of their parents and their former lives, unless they all suffered amnesia, but Sid says that they don't remember this happening to them because they were too young to remember it happening, not because they all hit their heads. In order for them to have been too young at the time of migration for them to remember anything, and for that migration to have happened 10 years ago, they would have had to be much younger than 16 years old and certainly much younger than 18. At that point, not only was it fucked up of the Crystal Gods to kill their parents for no good reason, but it was doubly fucked up for the Crystal Gods to put these kids, these literal fucking children, into unspeakable danger way before they were old enough to handle the pressure. So that begs the question, why exactly does the day even need saving in the first place? What exactly did the antagonist do to create the occasion for story? Well, legend has it that many eons ago, Xandi was an apprentice of a legendary mage named Noah, alongside Doga and Une. Each of these 3 apprentice mages were given a gift: magic to Doga, dreams to Une, and mortality to Xandi. Xandi, of course, didn't want to die, so to delay his death, he cast a curse on the land, which forced time to stop. Now, this makes no sense to me. First of all, does this mean that Xandi was immortal to begin with? How does that work? Are all magi immortal to begin with, or was it just Xandi who was immortal? For that matter, why couldn't Xandi just refuse the gift of mortality? Did he even have a say in the matter? I suppose not, since that's the only way this makes sense. But then, it was kind of a dick move to Noah to force Xandi to accept a gift he didn't want. For that matter, how is mortality as opposed to immortality a gift in the first place? How is it a gift to essentially force someone to die? Is he supposed to eventually get a release from the colossal boredom of having lived for millions of years, having seen and experienced everything that life has to offer, and so nothing could possibly excite him anymore? Wow, some gift, bro! Hey, while you're at it, how about a gift of genital herpes as well? I mean, could you have at least waited until he was so bored with life that he actually wanted this mercy killing, rather than forcing mortality on him before he was ready to accept it? It honestly would have made much more sense if Xandi was just a normal, mortal man who wanted to become immortal, not an immortal being who had mortality thrust upon him against his will and was desperately looking for a way to undo this curse. Now, bear in mind that I'm only really asking these questions because the game does fuck all to answer them. Just like with the main characters and their character arcs, just like with the main theme of destiny versus free will, Sakaguchi brings up this backstory and mythos but seems wholly uninterested in actually exploring it in any kind of depth. The end result is a game with a story that feels woefully incomplete. The first Final Fantasy game had a very simple story, but at least the majority of that story was definitively capped. It doesn't feel like there were whole chapters missing from the story. but I cannot say the same thing about Final Fantasy III. It's clear that Sakaguchi wanted to tell a very ambitious story, but didn't have the experience or storytelling skills needed to pull it off. However, all of that, the underdeveloped main characters, the unexplored main themes, the incomplete main plot, all of that pales in comparison to the end game. That's the part where Sakaguchi just severs the brake lines entirely. After we defeat Xande, you would expect that to be the end of the game. Peace reigns and credits roll, right? Nope! It turns out there's an entirely new threat that's been lurking just behind the curtains. Now that Xande is out of the picture, this new threat gets introduced at the very last minute with absolutely no build-up beforehand. It will take an entire section of this review to explain everything that's wrong with this plot twist. So that leads me to... Alright, let me discuss all the new stuff that's here before talking about what exactly is wrong with it. Up until this point, the power of light was said to represent good, while darkness was said to be the energy of evil. Xande called upon the power of darkness to freeze time, and it's the protagonist's job to use the power of light to push back the darkness. However, after Xande is defeated, it is revealed that darkness is just as important to the universe's continued existence as light. Many years ago, the universe was undergoing the opposite crisis to what it is now, with an onslaught of light threatening to banish the darkness. This was apparently just as toxic to the universe as the darkness banishing the light, since both forces must coexist in a delicate balance with each other in order to keep the universe from imploding in on itself. To combat this onslaught of light, 4 warriors of the dark were chosen to fight the light and restore darkness to its rightful place in the universe. They succeeded, but now inhabit the dark crystals in their afterlife. It turns out there are 4 dark crystals to complement 4 light crystals, for a grand total of 8 crystals. In addition to light and dark needing to coexist harmoniously, it also turns out that they have a matter-antimatter relationship, whereby they cancel each other out if they ever come into contact with each other, leaving a void, or literal nothingness, where they used to be. It turns out that the void is how the universe began, and that is also how the universe is destined to inevitably end. However, the end of the universe can be staved off with the power of hope, whatever that means, and so the warriors of the dark join forces with the warriors of the light to stave off the void. The Cloud of Darkness is the literal manifestation of the void, and the one who is truly determined to bring the universe to an end by returning it to the void. She is initially invincible and has the ability to kill all 4 warriors of the light in one hit with her particle beam attack. But if you rescue all 4 warriors of the dark from their dark crystals, they will join you and attack the Cloud of Darkness, eliminating her invincibility. With the Cloud's invincibility destroyed, we can finally engage her in combat, destroying the void and saving the day, this time for realsies. Got all that? Good. Now, if it comes off like I just delivered that exposition at the speed of sound, that's only because the game does. There is enough plot and mythos in this section of the game to fill an entire video game story in its own right. But instead, Sakaguchi decides to just pack all of this into the last dungeon of the game. As a result, all of this backstory and world building is delivered at an absolutely breakneck pace. There's hardly any time to soak it all in, not to mention there isn't enough time left in the game to properly explain all of this stuff. I mentioned earlier that a lot of the subplots in this game felt more like the Cliff Notes versions of the story that Sakaguchi actually wanted to tell, but this is the most egregious example of that feeling in the entire game. What exactly are the differences between dark and light? What exactly does each force entail? I thought light was a force for good while dark was a force for evil. But if the power of darkness can also be used for good, then what exactly are the properties of light and darkness respectively? Why exactly is their coexistence necessary? Clearly the world upon which the protagonists live is almost all light, so we obviously don't need darkness, at least not the magical kind of darkness of which you speak, to exist. How exactly is an excess of light dangerous? we see firsthand how an excess of dark is dangerous since that can cause time to freeze. But what about light? How is that dangerous? And if darkness and light cancel each other out to create a void whenever they come into contact, then how come we haven't been creating voids left, right, and center this entire game when we've been engaging dark enemies in combat? These are all questions that the game not only fails to adequately answer, but completely fails to even remotely bring up, because there's just no way for the game to adequately explain all the ideas that are introduced in this dungeon over the course of a single dungeon. I admire Sakaguchi's ambition with this story, but the problem there is that ambitious stories require ambitious delivery and ambitious execution. If you shoot for the moon with your story ideas, but then ultimately fail to even get your ideas off the ground, the audience is understandably going to be left wondering what the point even was. Now, I know what some of you are probably thinking right now, but this game was originally released for the Famicom. The cartridge was only a measly 512 kilobytes. Sakaguchi just didn't have enough space to work with to tell a story of this scope. To that I say, if you can't tell this story properly with the space allotted to you by a Famicom cartridge, maybe you should reconsider doing it at all. I mean, I agree to an extent. There's a lot of stuff here, not just in the final dungeon, but also in all the subplots and main plots that went either unresolved or under-resolved. But at the same time, Sakaguchi nonetheless bit off more than he could chew. He made his bed, so he needs to lie in it. I mean, if this was a story Sakaguchi really wanted to explore in depth, I doubt anyone would have objected to him making it on the Super Famicom that was just around the corner so that it could be told properly. But okay, let's assume for the sake of argument that Sakaguchi didn't expect the Super Famicom to be a viable option. After all, fellow Square game developer Hiromichi Tanaka explained that, back then, the Super Famicom was treading into untested waters, and it wasn't yet known if that new console was going to properly catch on. So, let's assume that Sakaguchi likewise believed that if he didn't make this game and tell this story on the Famicom, he wouldn't get a chance to tell this story at all. In that case, don't waste precious cartridge space on pointless crap! This game's main plot and all of its subplots could very easily have been told to the player in a much more efficient manner than what we actually got. In case I haven't made it clear, the biggest failing of this game's story is mostly how it is structured in such an incoherent manner. Plot points and subplots are just shoved into the story at seemingly random intervals with no regard for whether it is narratively expedient to do so, or even if the resulting concoction makes even the slightest bit of sense. It's basically the storytelling equivalent of balling up your clothes and shoving them into a suitcase, rather than folding them using the proper technique to ensure maximum storage efficiency. But Sakaguchi could very easily have delivered this main plot and all of its subplots in a much more streamlined and efficient manner if he wanted to. The limitations of this hardware did not force Sakaguchi to cram half the game's backstory into the final dungeon of the game. He could very easily have had the Dark Crystals take up the second half of the game, and it would have been infinitely better paced as a result. Imagine if you went through 4 dungeons, restored light to the 4 light crystals. Subplots such as Prince Alice and his mind-controlled father could be intertwined with the crystal plot in a manner similar to what I had described earlier in this video, thereby ensuring that each subplot had its own beginning, middle, and end. Then, you take out Zandy at the end of the 5th dungeon. However, it turns out that this 5th dungeon was only the halfway point. You then meet the new threat, the Cloud of Darkness, and spend the second half of the game in the World of Darkness. Dungeons 6 through 9 are spent unlocking the 4 Dark Crystals and rescuing the 4 Warriors of the Dark. Only this time, because each Dark Crystal has a dungeon to itself, that gives us quadruple as much room, both on the cartridge and in the story, to fully flesh out the Dark World's backstory and lore. Then the game culminates with the 10th dungeon, culminating in the final boss fight against the Cloud of Darkness. When you think about it that way, you realize that the cartridge space wasn't the problem. Hell, even more conventional writers who don't do game design often have maximum word or page limitations placed on them by their editors. The best writers are those who don't use those limitations as an excuse to publish shitty writing, but who instead roll with the punches and work around those limitations and force themselves to streamline their own writing style. That is what Sakaguchi could have and should have done with this game and its story. The limitations of the hardware didn't force Sakaguchi to give us this jumbled, incoherent clusterfuck of a mess. That came about not from the hardware itself, but from his refusal to make the story as compact and streamlined as possible. So, I'm sorry, but this game's story is an absolute failure across the board. The main characters are never developed. The main plot makes no sense. The subplots are scattered around in a seemingly random fashion. It's a gang-raped, bitch-slapped, broken down fucking mess of a story. If I had to describe this game in only a single phrase, it would be too aspirational for its own good. I definitely can appreciate an ambitious story, but this is a case where Sakaguchi's ambition far surpassed his actual skill as a storyteller. This game's ambition and vision were effectively squandered due to the game's poor narrative pacing and structure. The boss fights are in need of some serious rebalancing. Grinding should not be required just to play the game in the first instance. The main characters have threadbare personalities, but the obvious character arcs that practically gift-wrap themselves for Sakaguchi ultimately go entirely unexplored. The story is a clusterfuck of a mess, culminating in one of the most grandiose, yet most rushed, stories I have ever seen. For all of these reasons and more, I rank Final Fantasy III at the bottom of the list so far, beneath Final Fantasy I. Final Fantasy II may have had its own narrative pacing issues, but it is still the best of the original 8-bit trilogy by a wide margin. Next time, Final Fantasy will be making the leap to the 16-bit generation of consoles, when I do a retrospective on Final Fantasy II for the Super NES, also known as Final Fantasy IV. Well, ladies and gentlemen, if you enjoyed this retrospective, please hit that subscribe button for more videos just like it. Also, if you enjoy my content overall, please consider supporting the channel directly, either with Patreon support or channel memberships. Silver and Gold level members and Patreon supporters are allowed to submit requests for video topics, and Gold members and Patreon supporters are allowed to directly assign me video topics that I am guaranteed to cover. In the meantime, however, I am Acerthorn, and I will see you guys later. Peace!